You're listening to Dodge Movie Podcast. Your hosts are Christy and Mike Dodge, the founders of Dodge Media Productions. We produce films and podcasts, so this is a podcast about films. Join them as they share their passion for filmmaking.
Looking to start a podcast but don't know where to begin? Look no further. The team at Dodge Media Productions has 20 years of experience as podcast listeners and observing the industry and 8 years experience in podcast production. We can help you take your podcast from idea to fruition, and we'll make the process seamless and easy. We'll help you with everything from recording and editing to hitting the charts on Apple Podcasts. So what are you waiting for? Contact us today and let's get started. DodgeMediaProductions.com.
Welcome to the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a film called Song Sung Blue. As a child, there was a shampoo called Selsun Blue, and I was very confused for many years about, well, that singer can't pronounce the shampoo right, that commercial's not going to work. But no, this is about the Neil Diamond song. It's funny that when you suggested we go see this film, I thought it was a Neil Diamond biopic. It is a biopic, and it is a little bit about Neil Diamond, but it's not a biopic of Neil Diamond.
There's a lot of people that have that same confusion. My mom and I went and saw Beautiful Noise, which is a musical based on Neil Diamond's life. And as we were walking out, somebody goes, "Now I want to go see that movie." And the person next to him said, "Which movie?" And they said, it's about this guy. It's about a cover band for Neil Diamond. And they were like, "Oh, I thought it was about Neil Diamond." So you're not the only one that thought that.
Well, that's good. I am a dim bulb at times, so it could have been just me. I think there were two problems. One, for obvious reasons in the film, Hugh Jackman's character looks a little like Neil Diamond. Which,
well, yeah, but that's
because his character is trying to be a little like Neil Diamond for performance.
Yeah, it's cute because the character starts out in a I guess it's called a cover band, or no, it's a bunch of impersonators. There's like a Buddy Holly impersonator and a Patsy Cline impersonator, and so he was supposed to show up and be the Don Ho impersonator. And so then when he and Kate Hudson's character kind of first get together, he goes, "I don't want to be an impersonator," and she goes, "You're not. You're an interpreter."
That's kind of like my interpretation of a s'more. No, it's a new thing. But anyway, I think the nature of these kinds of films where that confusion could happen, but for some reason, it seems to have happened more with this film. So maybe the trailer didn't emphasize enough that it was a cover band interpreter. Don't know. But anyway.
I don't know, because I got it right away, because I think even the scene where she says, "You're not," now I keep getting confused in my head, "You're not an impressionist, you're an interpreter." I mean, I got all along that they were a cover band.
Perhaps the trailer was perfectly well done and some of us are just dim bulbs, but
I wonder if it's because you're not a Neil Diamond fan that you kind of checked out.
Yes, it could be I wasn't paying
you were
super
like,
close
"I'm not
attention.
interested in this movie."
Part of this is, I'll be honest, when I see Hugh Jackman and Kate Hudson, I'm in probably no matter what. Like, okay, I like their work. Let's see what they had to do. Mm-hmm. Growing up, Neil Diamond was a thing. I thought, though, that he wasn't nearly as big as he was in terms of number of albums sold and cultural impact.
Oh my gosh.
To me, it seemed like the women of the previous generation in my family of origin were the ones who liked him, and no one else did. I didn't know other people's parents listened to Neil Diamond. I thought it was just kind of a niche artist that those two women liked, and that was the end of that. But you have mentioned, subsequent to the film, the number of albums he has sold over time. This guy has a huge cultural impact beyond the jazz singer. I was surprised to know that, but it was an interesting story because I didn't know much about Neil Diamond, but I knew nothing about Claire and Mike Santini or Sardini? Anyway.
Sardino.
I knew nothing about these people. I'd never heard of them before. So to me, it was effectively a drama about people that I didn't know. It wasn't really a biopic of Neil Diamond, which is great because I knew relatively nothing about Neil Diamond, so I wasn't surprised.
Neil Diamond's career spans 5 decades. He had a big hit in the 50s, I think, maybe early 60s, called Solitary Man. And then he wrote many. He wrote for he wrote for the Monkees, which he wasn't super proud of. But I'm a Believer is a song of his, which has been covered by many people, including Smash Mouth, which is probably the most recent kind of iteration that people would be familiar with. But he wrote for, I don't know, I'm going up on my lines because he wrote for many acts that now, of course, I can't remember. But he also he was the number one touring artist in I think the 80s and 90s. He worked 300 days out of the year. He sold more records than Elvis. Now I guess you could say Elvis died way too young, and so maybe his career would have spanned longer. And then just culturally an impact, I mean, I think it was cute. He's been honored a Kennedy Center honoree, and at that concert they showed that Sweet Caroline apparently is now kind of right up there with the seventh inning stretch kind of. There are many football teams and baseball teams that play it as kind of a break, and it's a song that you can be almost anywhere and people sing along. They know, because that chorus I think is just so easy to pick up. You see people just get happy singing that song. And then of course America, and his career, I had no idea. I mean, I've always been a fan, but I had no idea the expanse of his career, I guess.
That was why I brought that up, because you mentioned Elvis. If somebody made a movie about an Elvis interpreter, I would know the context of Elvis. So that would land in a certain kind of way. But in this way, it was a relatively small, to my thought, part of the culture, which turns out to be very large. So I went into it perhaps with a different perspective than, for example, I would have Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, where I knew more about the artist in question. And if you're making a biopic, that is perhaps something as a filmmaker you need to contemplate, which is how much is your audience going to know about the person, and how much are they going to care if you don't quite do things or present things the way that they would want.
But I think ultimately the core of this story, you didn't even need to know anything about Neil Diamond himself, because it was a story about these two individuals who wanted to do nothing more than, I think, to perform, to experience a certain level of fame. They didn't, I mean, I think they spoke of wanting to play in Vegas, which they never got to do. But within, I believe it was Wisconsin or Missouri, within their state, it was Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was
Minnesota or Wisconsin, somewhere in there.
Yeah, they were huge. People followed them. They would play at bars. They would play at the state fair. They would play, a bunch of different places, and they had a following. They had fans. In fact, there's an accident, to try to avoid spoilers to our friends who wait until the movie is not in the theater anymore. There's an accident, and when it happened, it made news. I don't know of a local band that if something happened to one of the band members where it would make news. So these people had a following. You could just say Lightning and Thunder, and people were like, oh yeah, I saw them at the fair. Oh yeah, I caught them at this place. That's what they wanted to do. They just wanted to play their music, his music. They wanted to entertain, and they were enjoying their life. And then Mike Sardino was a Vietnam veteran and came back, and I think was always kind of struggling to find his place. And then when he became this Neil Diamond interpreter, I think he kind of found his lane, and then he found his wife, it's like a beautiful love story. And then how they walk through these challenges and tragedies in their family is what largely I would say the movie's about.
As an aside, if you're a Neil Diamond interpreter, don't you have to play bar mitzvahs? Hey-o! I thought that this was an interesting capture of this perhaps independence of a passion for a thing versus the commercial success of the thing. I went to university with a fellow who loved to sing. He was a music minor. He took all of the vocal classes, and the other musicians privately said he just didn't have that much talent. He was never going to be a professional singer, but he loved it passionately. And I felt these two were like that. Not saying that they weren't professional level singers, but their performance was not really going to be at the level that Neil Diamond's was at, but they still had as much passion as Neil does. So for me, that was an interesting thing to explore, this couple who had this shared love and were willing to pursue it. That was their life's goal, even though that wasn't going to be bring in huge amounts of coin for them. I think as an independent filmmaker, that hits very close to home because I am passionate about making films, but make zero money off of it. So in that sense, I'm a little bit like them, and I can see that. I hope that comes through for people who maybe don't have an artistic avocation like that, for the viewer to see that love they have of music and performing. And I think in particular, the scene where it's the first time they met, or one of the first times they met, and he went back to her place and they played music together. And you would, when you say the phrase, he went back to her place, you would think they were going to do another kind of activity. But in this case, that's how much they loved their music. And I would love to be that talented, but am not musically. So I really respected their character's passion for this. And I thought the filmmaker did a pretty good job of capturing, I don't know if I would call it the innocence, but that joy with that, but also some of the travails that the two of them had, because like all people, they are flawed in some ways and they make mistakes and they have struggles. You mentioned that you'd learned separately outside of the film that while in Vietnam, he was a tunnel rat, which for those who maybe don't know, these individuals had to go down into these tunnels. And by that, I don't mean like the tunnel you see on a Western where they get the gold. It's basically a 12-inch diameter hole in the ground to look for the bad guys. And you crawl down there, and in the dark and claustrophobic confines, I can't imagine what that would do to a person on top of just being in any sort of war zone. Oh my gosh. So when a person comes back after those experiences, even though the film doesn't explicitly show that, you can have some compassion for how this person would have some struggles. And it looked like maybe he had some struggles with, smoking or drinking and other things. And I say that not to be critical of the individual, because these were real human beings. And I just say that to say that I think this film captured, like a good drama does, the ups and downs of an individual's life. As a filmmaker, you're tasked with choosing the story, choosing the scenes to show to support the story. But when it's someone's life, that's an interesting thing, because perhaps to tell the story that they were telling, we've heard this a lot when you make movies about real stories, that characters will be combined just because the audience has a hard time tracking 37 different characters. But I could also see how if this was your life, you would be upset to have it either exclude you or even just rewritten. Well, that's not how I remember it.
So I watched the documentary after I watched the movie.
Okay.
And it's funny because as we were driving home, I said to you, what'd you think? And you said it was really sad. And then I watched the documentary and it's even more sad. So, and I say this with all compassion for this couple, because what they went through, I can't even imagine individually, and then once they got together. And I think when you throw in issues of poverty seems too strong, but issues dealing with money. But when you're a singing act and somebody has an accident and then you're not working, I can't even imagine how that affects the finances. So they're dealing with financial issues. They're dealing with, Mike was a recovering alcoholic, but like many years. I think when the movie starts, he got his 20-year chip or something.
Yeah, he had a chip at the beginning of the film.
Yeah, and so, but there's still those issues that brought you to that, and I think,
Correct.
Speaking to his time in Vietnam probably explains it. And then after her accident, she was dealing with some addiction issues. And then you've got broken marriages because they both had children before, and now you're blending a family. I mean, so I just want to be very clear that anything I say is not coming from a place of judgment, but a place of compassion, because they're dealing with a lot. And I think especially, a family in the Midwest in probably the late 80s, early 90s maybe is when.
That's what I'm guessing, yeah.
So the documentary was hard to watch at times because you're seeing real life. You're seeing people frustrated and struggling with a lot of the issues that I just mentioned. And I think when humans are dealing with those type of issues, you're not the kindest always. And so I felt that we didn't see really the depths of that in either Kate's character or Hugh's character. And maybe that's for the best, because I don't know, it could have come off as critical maybe of the Sardinos. And I know that Kate was very concerned in how they would feel being portrayed in a certain way. So I think that the filmmakers chose kindness over reality. And I guess if you want to see a glimpse of that reality, you could watch the documentary. It's on YouTube. It's the same title, Song Sung Blue. And I don't know if you need to show, you didn't need to copy the documentary scene for scene in order to tell this story. And maybe does it make it have more broader appeal by not making it so based in reality? Because you still got that they had a sad life, because that's what you came away with.
It was very sad. Yeah, I saw in an interview someone had asked Kate about some difference between the perceived reality and the movie, and she said, I'm not the person to speak about that. You'd have to talk to the filmmaker about that decision, which I think is very true. I find it ironic that we're talking about a biopic that's representing somebody, but then we also expect that the actor who is just playing a role is representing the film as a whole. And I guess if you're the director-actor combo, person who's both stars in it as well as directs it, we can ask those questions. But for Kate, she was doing the role that she saw on the page. We know that some actors do a lot of detailed work to learn about the character or to come up with a backstory in case of a fictional character, not Ben Affleck, of course, but other actors. And this is a case where I don't know to what degree she was involved in that, or do you come into that with fresh eyes to say, I don't want to watch the documentary before I do my acting performance because I want to approach this film independent of that, and then do you go back and watch it? Or perhaps they both did a deep dive and wanted to learn as much as possible about that story.
I know Hugh watched it first.
I think you possibly would, but I could also see a person saying, no, I want to be free of any taint of somebody else's interpretation. And that's really what that is. I know it must be hard if it's your life or your father's life, but all of these things are an interpretation. And you mentioned that the documentary is even more sad, which is stunning to me, because I found that this film was quite sad to me. And I know that life has sadness and people can have struggles, but it was a sad film to me. I do think there was a certain amount of, I don't know if I would say hope or optimism, or it wasn't really necessarily a happy ending, but there was some sort of fulfillment of their dreams of being these performers. But ultimately, I do think the story itself is one of sadness and loss. And that is what some people get more than others, right? I also think that Hugh did a very good job in this role. My concern, of course, was after The Greatest Showman and being on Broadway and different things, is it going to be difficult for him to be a new kind of singing character? But he did. I think he pulled it off. I think I didn't see Greatest Showman in this one. I felt like he did a good acting job of becoming the character. I wasn't so much watching Hugh Jackman as I was watching this character. I feel like Kate Hudson brought a different energy and a different look to this role than I think, for example, like Glass Onion. So both of them, in my opinion, did an excellent job. I thought it was a good movie. I wouldn't call it a criticism, but the only maybe slight lack of enjoyment for me was just it was sad.
I was really surprised that so the Critics' Choice Awards has happened since as of this recording, and the Golden Globes. And I would have thought that she would have been nominated. Maybe she wouldn't have won, but I felt like her performance definitely would have garnered her some nominations. Oh, and maybe she was nominated for a Golden Globe now that I think about it, because she did get a nomination for that. And I wouldn't have been surprised by that, because I felt like it was one of these, not Oscar bait, but her performance, because it was a full rounded character, because she physically, I believe, changed her body. There was still that Kate Hudson sparkle that her and her mom are so well known for, like the laugh and the smile. I mean, it's a gigawatt kind of smile. So there were times when you like her Kate Hudson-ness peek through. But I thought for the most part, she did kind of meld into Claire Sardino and become that person. And especially because, you know, when she goes through her accident and then deals with the being kind of becoming dependent on the pain pills, and that changed her personality, I felt like you saw a Kate Hudson that we don't usually see, you know, the maybe angry and not so bubbly, happy Kate Hudson. And so that was kind of a new thing for her. And so I thought the acting in this was amazing, that the actors that played their children were amazing. Jim Belushi playing their tour manager, and then Fisher Stevens. Like, it was a really, and Michael Imperioli. And I listened to my second favorite podcast, the DGA, and the director said that he knew he wanted Imperioli to be in it because he's in a band outside of acting. And so he wanted people who could play the instruments who were performing in the movie. So I love this movie. I thought it was really good.
One of the things we've talked about in the past, and we've coined the verb to Favreau, is when extras in the background of a scene are catching the eye. And there was a scene when you mentioned Jim Belushi, they're in a casino of some sort at a table talking, and in the background behind Jim Belushi, there's an extra who's a woman. She's wearing like a light blue, I think even sparkly top, who sashays through the background in the exact opposite of probably what they asked for her to do, because she caught my eye. It was so just completely over the top. I really quite enjoyed it. So credit to that background actor for her performance. One of the things from a production standpoint, speaking of Kate Hudson's performance, is there is an injury that occurs that's pivotal to the plot. And I assume, of course, they had to do that with CGI. And for a film of this sort, I don't know what budget they had. I did read that they recouped their budget in box office, which makes sense, but good for them from a business perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious how much that would be, because I was reading in another film's trivia that they needed a dog to poop on the yard, and the people on set would not let them give the dog laxatives, so they had to add that in CGI and post at a certain dollar cost. And I was thinking, I don't know the current running cost for this kind of computer-aided filmmaking, but that is a really interesting question about when you're making the film. Do you do the blocking? Do you do some sort of on-set special effects? Do you do visual effects and post-processing? The joke we always have on television sitcoms is if an actress gets pregnant, she's carrying the grocery bags or a cardboard box in front of her belly for the entire season. How do you go about doing that? Obviously, to me, it seems in this case they did it in post, which is fine. It was seamless. But I do think with those kinds of things, especially when we're talking a period piece, you're also looking at costs for costumes and motor vehicles and all that kind of set dressing that you have to do, how the decision goes to break that down, because a storytelling perspective, you might want to show, let's say, a long shot, where that takes away your ability to hide certain things with tricks of props or what have you. So that would be an interesting conversation. Maybe on the DGA podcast, the director brought that up, about how you decide how to shoot the film when you have to work around that kind of a plot point.
Yeah, I've heard other directors talk about that. I think maybe because this one was in the 80s and 90s, it's not like trying to shoot a movie in the 60s where,
right,
like, there was a movie we watched not too long ago, and it was such a quick scene, and you paused it and you said, look at how many cars they had to replace and storefronts and the like to make it look like a 1960s movie.
Right.
And so he didn't talk about the production cost as much as that goes. It was more, I think, kind of how they got to, because I think Hugh was already, he was already attached to this project, and somebody texted him because Kate Hudson put out an album, and so she was on CBS Sunday Morning, and somebody called him and said, "Are you watching Kate Hudson right now?" And he turned it on, and he was like, "Oh, there's our Claire," because she was singing and talking about kind of, she had felt that Hollywood was just kind of done with her. And so she was going to pursue the singing. And so he reached out to her and said, watch this documentary and tell me what you think. So, and I think it was not seeing the script. I think they both said, yeah, I'm in.
Interesting saying that she thought that Hollywood was done with her, because I would cast her in a rom-com today, right? No problems whatsoever. I wonder, when you do a film like this with the music, how much that is an issue, because we know that if you're using an artist's performance of a song, it can be extremely expensive to get the recording and use it in the movie. But when you have your actors perform a song, I think the songwriter still gets some degree of payment, but it's much, much less. However, you need to have it be as good as a real recording for the audience to buy it. So the cost maybe there is in the audio engineering on the day of, as well as the sound engineering after the fact. I'm curious about these. I like musicals. I like movies with music in them. I think it's perhaps a cost-effective way to have your actors do the singing than record it. But I'm curious if there's, from a filmmaking perspective, if they had to do things different, knowing that they have this music. And in fact, there are certain songs which you absolutely have to have in a movie about someone who's a Neil Diamond interpreter.
Yeah, I was surprised that America wasn't featured more.
Yes, I was too.
I mean, they showed he had different vests that he would put on for kind of like quick costume changes.
Right.
And he did have an American flag looking vest, but the song didn't feature, which I wonder. I've never, and I did go down a rabbit hole with Neil Diamond interviews. I never heard him say like that he didn't feel as proud about that song, but they did what they did say that without Neil Diamond's blessing, they couldn't have done this movie, because he wouldn't have given the rights to all of his music, because it's his entire catalog. And he was familiar with Mike and Claire, and they were going to meet him, but the day before, Mike experienced some heart issues and he was in the hospital. And so Claire later met Neil Diamond by herself.
Yeah, I was going to ask the question about that life rights, because a Neil Diamond interpreter doesn't really have Neil's permission, right? And I think that's covered by fair use. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, but in a film like this, I don't know about the legalities, but I think functionally you would need Neil Diamond's blessing, as well as presumably the blessing of the individuals involved. But that is an
It
interesting
sounds like
thing.
they had that, except for the one son.
I just can't imagine what it would be like if I found out there was a Mike Dodge impersonator out there somewhere. That would just be really kind of, I think, weird as an individual, and maybe as a performer.
Well, maybe since you're not a performer. Neil actually was very touched by their enthusiasm and adoration of his music.
Well, I think I would want to give them notes. Like, I don't say that. That's not right. So you'd have to, maybe the lack of control that I wouldn't be comfortable with.
I think you're telling us a lot about yourself right now.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so I'll just put it out there. If there is a Mike Dodge impersonator out there, please contact me. I'd like to review your work. I noticed that back in the Midwest, I thought it was more of a St. Louis thing, but apparently it's in Minneapolis as well. This frozen custard is a big deal. And I had heard that there was one particular place that Neil was known to visit around when he was in the area for the concert.
He would either go there after his concert, or he would send somebody to get some.
I assume this was great for their business, this film?
Yes, it was, because he said this, like, when I'm next here. So then fans would also leave the concert and go to, and people who didn't get a ticket would go, I believe it was called Floyd's, would go to this, it was like a drive-in, but kind of a larger drive-in, and then they would wait for him to show up.
So I'm thinking, if you have teacup giraffe money, which Neil Diamond does.
Oh yeah, even though he gave quite a bit to his second wife.
Right. You invest in Floyd's. Maybe you don't buy it outright, but you're a silent buyer. I'm just thinking that's what I would do. I'd want Floyd's to be there year in, year out. So I'm going to go ahead and invest and make sure that, plus you'd eat for free if you're an owner, right? Yeah. So with Greatest Showman and now Sung Sung Blue, Hugh is obviously establishing himself as a triple threat. And I love that. I love musicals, as I've said even on this podcast, but everyone who listens knows this. I'm curious what his next project is. There must be something in the queue, right? Because you know
we saw a trailer.
Well, was it a musical thing though?
No.
Yeah, I was thinking everybody who has like a musical in Hollywood, you got to send the script to Hugh, right? Like, hey, do you want to get involved? I'm curious if this is a thing where I know he had put a lot of his time into getting The Greatest Showman made. That was a project that he was involved with for quite some time. I don't know necessarily about this one, but it is interesting that an actor that I was introduced to as Wolverine, I didn't really know his work much, if at all, before that role, but that I wouldn't say is the majority of his work. I think as an actor, he wouldn't be categorized really as an action star. And this is a departure. I don't know, Kate Hudson is known for singing. Obviously, you said she had an album out, but I don't know in her films. I know her more for things like Glass Onion and some rom-coms with McConaughey, that kind of thing. So this is great to see what I consider to be another level of resurgence of musical cinema in Hollywood. We had a bit of a desert for a while there, and then with La La Land and Greatest Showman, I think they've come back to it, and we're seeing a film like this. I don't think this film could have been made 10 or 20 years ago. I don't think Hollywood would pull the trigger on something that relied on music like this.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think, too, we've seen other, not only kind of like biopics like Rocket Man, and then there was the one with the young boy who was inspired by Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, right. There was a Beatles one where a guy went to alternative history with Beatles music. And
but then you've got the Baz Luhrmann Elvis one. And so, yeah, I think you definitely are starting to see, there's the one I really want to see with Jeremy Allen White as Bruce Springsteen.
Right.
So I do think you're seeing kind of, and I wonder if, you know, we saw it on Broadway where there's the Gloria Estefan one, then there was the Tina Turner one, there's the Beautiful Noise with Neil Diamond's music, then there's the Carole King. It's based on her music and her life. And then I thought of another one. Oh, The Girl from North Country, and it's all music of Bob Dylan.
Those are movies about the music of a famous person, but I think there's also been a resurgence in movies about musicians, just the characters of musicians. I was thinking Flora and Me with, I think, Bono's daughter.
Yeah,
good film. That kind of thing. So this is great. I'm super happy about that. Not quite as much dancing yet, but maybe they'll get there, right?
Like an old-fashioned, like 50s musical?
Yes, like Fred Astaire with the big wide. That was the thing that always impressed me, was they'd have these big wide shots that with no cuts. And it was so impressive that the actors were able to dance and sing in a consistent take that way. Whereas one of the things I learned about watching a documentary about the John Wick films is that action films often cut very quickly to help them stitch together performances physically. So if you don't get it quite right, you can cut and use a different take. And I would assume you would do similar things with dancing, and that's why I was impressed with, of course, White Christmas is a period topical piece for me, but with the long numbers with the wide shot, because you're not able to cut around things. People actually do the entire number in one shot. It's kind of like their own oneer. So I think this film is a good film, but you don't have to be a Neil Diamond fan to enjoy it. I think it's less about Neil Diamond and more about these people.
I think it's more about individuals dealing with tragedy and obstacles.
Yes, with a couple catchy Neil Diamond tunes in there as well. I'm impressed with the performances of Mr. Jackman and Ms. Hudson. They do a fantastic job. I would give this a qualified, go see it. It is a little sad for some, like myself, so be aware going into it. But I thought it was a good film. I wouldn't say I was surprised, but it was different than I expected, and I liked it. I thought it was a good film. Any closing thoughts on Song Sung Blue?
Nope, other than to reiterate go see it.
And as always, Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.
Thanks for listening to Dodge Movie Podcast with Christy and Mike Dodge of Dodge Media Productions. To find out more about this podcast and what we do, go to dodgemediaproductions.com. Subscribe, share, leave a comment, and tell us what we should watch next. Dodges never stop, and neither do the movies.